it is better to keep it on.
Welcome back to day 2 of Gas World Tech I 2021. Very good afternoon to the distinguished speakers and dignitaries who will be participating in this online conference, Transition into Sustainable Low Carbon Economy. I'm delighted to share Chemtech has received overwhelming response and support from the industry and government bodies for this event, and the active participation and support in the event, and the members of our Central Advisory Board for their support to our 3-day conference. The topic of discussion for this session is infrastructure and logistics. We have with us Mr. Ashu Singhal, ED, GAIL India Limited, as the session chair and moderator for the session on infrastructures and logistics. Mr. Ashu Singhal, sir, is a mechanical engineer graduate from NIT Shilkar and holds a master's degree in business administration, MBA, with specialization in operation management. He's presently heading corporate strategy, planning and advocacy, risk management and total quality management departments at GAIL India Limited as executive director, while also being responsible for the role of chief risk officer of the organization. He's serving director on the board of ONGC Petro Additions Limited, OPAL, and Talcher Fertilizer Limited. He has also served terms as director on the board of Mahanagar Gas Limited, MGL. Mr. Singhal has rich experience of more than 30 years in hydrocarbon sector, covering diverse functional areas, which includes corporate strategy, large-scale project execution, including cross-country gas pipelines, petrochemical, and LNG. He works in close association with top management in strategic decision making of GAIL. Key liaison point for stakeholder management initiatives under natural gas advocacy program with various multilateral organizations, industry, resulting in accurate realization of benefits of over 1,000 crore through operation efficiencies, cost reduction, and revenue maximization. Mr. Singhal has also represented the Indian industry delegation in prestigious international visitor leadership program by US government. The speakers for this session are Mr. Satinder Pal Singh, CEO, Adani Total Private Limited, who will be speaking on regasification terminals. Mr. David Cirelli, India Country Manager, SNAM, who will be speaking on transportation of hydrogen gas. Dr. Klaus Born, Director R&D, Elliott Group, who will be speaking on building agile gas infrastructure to be used possibly for the hydrogen delivery in future. Now, I hand over the session to Mr. Ashu Singhal, sir. What do you, sir?
Thank you very much, Dipesh, for your kind words and also for inviting me for this panel discussion. It is my honor and privilege to welcome the eminent speakers on the panel. And just to start and kick off, I will give a brief introduction to the eminent speakers. And then I will maybe give a background to what the conference and the subject about is. And after that, I will request one by one the speakers to give their opening remarks and maybe a small presentation as they did. So the first speaker from on the panel would be Mr. Satinder Pal Singh, who likes to call SP, and he is the Chief Executive Officer of Adani Total Private Limited and a director in the nearly completed Dhamra LNG terminal. He is a key player in bringing these two industries together, that is Total and Adani, to grow the LNG business in India. And Mr. Singh is a veteran in the industry with over 25 years of experience. And in his previous role, he has headed Adani Corp's LNG vertical from 2016 to when his JV was formed, during which he brought Dhamra to FID by negotiating various agreements with IOC and GAIL. The company which I represent was also part of it. Prior to that, his 19 years career with Shell, and he has led several assignments for creating new markets in South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. So he brings a lot of international expertise and experience, along with the rich experience in the LNG industry. So we will be definitely looking to hear from him and his views on the gas infrastructure, particularly related to regas terminals. The second speaker is Mr. David Cirelli, who is the country manager for SNAM. SNAM company does not need any introduction. So, he's a rich experience and international experience in upstream, midstream, and downstream. Mr. David is graduated in BA Economics from Italy and Sweden and Masters of Science in Finance between Italy and China. He has extensive on the field experience and multiple language proficiency. It's a great thing. He is very fluent in Italian, English, Spanish, and French. So he worked former at Total ENP in Paris headquarters and former ENI SIPM in multiple geographies and is currently country manager and CEO of SNAM in India. So we look forward to you, Mr. David, to hear your expert views, particularly on transportation of hydrogen. The third and the most important and eminent personality on the panel is Dr. Klaus Bern. He is again a very renowned person in the field of R&D in Elliott Group, where he leads a group of over 60 professionals in the development of turbo machinery and related systems for energy industry. He has past experience includes position in product development, application engineering, project management in Southwest Research Institute, solar turbines, General Electric, and Alstom. He holds 10 patents and he has authored over 350 papers and published 4 textbooks on energy systems and turbo machinery. Dr. Bern is a fellow of American ASME and won R&D 100 awards in 2007 for his semi-active valve invention. He has also ASME International Industrial Gas Turbine Award in 2016 and 11 individuals ASME Turbo Expo Best Paper Awards. Dr. Bern is currently the executive correspondent of Turbo Machinery International magazine and associate editor of several journal transactions. It is our great honor to have you here, Doctor, and it will be definitely my pleasure to hear your views, and the type of resume you have will definitely give some lot of credit to what you speak, and let us hear you out on this. To kick off, I will like to give a brief overview of what my views are on this subject, and maybe slightly touch upon the topic, and then I will request first SP to start his presentation and views, followed by Mr. David and Dr. Claude. So as you know, India is in a cusp of change wherein things are very dynamic, the infrastructure is being developed. We are an economy which is growing. We are the third largest economy in terms of energy after China and US. But the more important part is that we have to develop an infrastructure which is more conducive for a sustainable development and more friendly to the carbon emissions and the economic, whatever commitments India is making. So I see gas is going to play a major role in it because currently India is a coal-based economy and almost 80%, close to 80% is in the primary energy coming from coal and oil. Gas currently is at 7%, but the ambition is to go to 15%, which I believe is a ambitious target, considering the energy growth which is expected at the rate of 4 to 5% per annum for coming few years or coming decades. So if we take that into account and also take into account that 7 to 15% is double, and considering the energy growth which is going to happen, the target to reach 15% will be almost 4 times of current consumption level. So that's a big challenge by 2030. But lots of things are happening because the point of focus is to create infrastructure, and some of them is like GAIL. We are developing a lot of pipelines. Currently, we are at 19,000 kilometers in countrywide cross-country gas pipelines, which is going to go up to close to 34,000 in another 4 or 5 years. So we are expected to connect the major geographies, mostly in the eastern part of the country, as well as into the other territories which like northeast part of the country where the pipeline have not reached. Besides that, I mean, a lot of investments are coming in gas infrastructure, whole value chain, starting with gas pipelines, then CGD. That is one success story which maybe many people know. But going forward, after the 11th round of bidding is completed, almost 95% of population will be covered. So that's again a big achievement for India, because after electrification of complete all households, we are going to achieve connectivity of all CGDs and geographies in India. Huge investments are coming into that area in CGD, wherein industrial, commercial, PNG, and CNG segments are going to go up like anything. We have ambitious target to increase the reach of CNG stations as well as PNG connectivity. So things are, I mean, in the radar of the government, and a lot of investment is coming from private, public, and all other stakeholders. There are a lot of policy enablers are happening in terms of bringing more gas in India, either via import of LNG or increasing the domestic gas production. So infrastructure is getting created in terms of a lot of investment happening in E&P. Mainly Reliance and ONGC is expected to bring another 50 to 60 billion standard cubic meter gas in another 3 to 4 years time. Followed by that, pipeline infrastructure is getting created. Then we are seeing that LNG terminals, maybe Mr. David will talk more about it, and Mr. SP will also talk more about the LNG regas terminals. So we have currently 40 MTPA capacity, which is expected to go up to 60 MTPA. That is around 200 MMSCMD. But if we have to reach to 15%, we have to see that domestic gas is not sufficient to meet that type of numbers. So mostly a lot of gas needs to be imported because transnational pipelines are not yet fructified in India. So either the domestic gas consumption or the import of LNG is expected to meet the growth in the gas numbers. The other is biogas fuels, which a lot of investment is happening in that area also. And lastly is the LNG applications like small scale LNG stations. A lot of quadrilateral, in the golden quadrilateral 4 national highways is getting connected, and ambitious plans are there to create almost 1,000 LNG dispensing units. So this is what the main infrastructure looks like in India. And I believe almost close to $60 billion of investment is happening in the whole gas value chain, which is around 4 lakh crores of rupees. So that's good number. The potential is there. The market is untapped. The growth numbers are there. The per capita income is low. The infrastructure is going to be created in some time to come. The connectivities will be there. The power sector is one area where we can always target to increase the consumption levels. So in nutshell, what we see, a lot of reforms are happening in the policy side, like TSO, transmission system operator, is being created. Then there is a gas exchange was last year inaugurated. Then GAIL has an open access portal, which is already functional. And some regulatory reforms are coming with respect to unification of tariff to make it more affordable. One point is that gas in GST is a long pending demand from the industry members, and we hope it is going to be enacted upon very soon. So in this whole thing, I see that the infrastructure is going to play an important role. And in that manner, maybe it is very apt to invite SP now to speak about how can we, how do we see the regas terminal particularly, whether the capacity of 60 MTPA, how do we see that 20 MTPA is expected to actually materialize in few years, or 60 MTPA, whether it is sufficient or not. So before, bombarding you with questions, I will request you to give your opening remarks, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Shingle. It's a pleasure to be part of such an august panel. It's great to see old friends on the group here as well. So it's a real, indeed, I'm really happy to participate and share whatever views I have on this matter. Mr. Shingle, a lot of what you've said actually covers, I think it provides an excellent overview, frankly, of everything that is good and maybe not so good about gas in India today. And when I look at gas, I've, as you mentioned when you were sort of narrating my profile, I've spent more than 25 years in this sector, and a lot of that time actually I've also spent in India, working on various projects. Right from the beginning when I was on Hazira, and then Kakinada, Dhamra, Mundra. And I think if there's one thing which always comes to my mind when I'm asked to describe the Indian gas sector, is, there's so much of potential, and yet sometimes we are made to feel a bit like an orphan child. We are in the middle. You have dirty coal on one side and you've got very green renewable on the other, and we are somewhere in the middle. And I think we are, sometimes I get the feeling that we are actually trying to make this very giant step to cross over from coal right into renewables. And the whole transition fuel of gas gets somewhere lost in the middle. And hence, indeed, I think, and why is that so? I think a lot of it is perhaps the very nature of gas. LNG in particular is typified, has been typified until the recent past by very long-term commitments to be made along the chain. It's a capital-intensive business, as everybody knows, and apart from some of the really large deals struck in the last century between Qatar and India, we have typically shied away from making long-term commitments in this sector. And the commercial nature of developing LNG infrastructure is such that without a large counterparty or a large sort of entity underwriting the risk required to create such a value chain, infrastructure usually takes a long time to come up. And that is one of my first and key comments that I would like to just share as an opening is the gas industry normally, and this period that we are currently in is perhaps an anomaly because LNG prices in particular are so high. But this is an aberration and not really the trend. The trend has been that if you look at the last 5 to 10 years, or as long as the industry has been, you will see that LNG has traded at a significant discount, somewhere in the region of 20 to 30% to comparable liquid fuels. So LNG has always been an affordable alternative to liquid fuels. There has been a lot more gas. There is a lot more gas in the world than there is oil. So LNG and gas have been abundant compared to oil. And finally, I think the environmental benefits of burning gas, as it's the cleanest burning fossil fuel when compared to oil, etc. So it's even acceptable. So the 3 A's of gas have been: it's affordable, it's acceptable, it's abundant. And yet we've been a bit cagey, if I were to use the term, in making longer term commitments. I think your company, sir, GAIL, has been excellent in making long-term commitments in picking up volumes from the US. It is that kind of bold moves which are required to help us get closer to the 15%. Compared to the investments that are required to underwrite a 10-year stake in a liquefaction terminal or a 15-year SPA, a regas terminal, the investment pales in comparison. Even though a regas terminal still costs upwards of $700-800 million, it is relatively small change compared to the investments that are made upstream. So my own submission is that if we can correct the perception in the market, and we can fix via the right incentives in the market for people to feel more comfortable in contracting for LNG and gas in general, the infrastructure will surely follow. And towards that, I think you already picked up on some of the anomalies which the government needs to correct. Things like GST. I think already there has been. You talked about the unbundling of GAIL. I think there's some more work that can be done there. The pipeline being created is a great enabler. And I think what I call the secular distribution of infrastructure. India has an abnormally high concentration of LNG infrastructure in Gujarat. And one of the things that particularly pleases me of the project that I'm currently maturing in Orissa is that we are creating a brand new market in this country. And that kind of democratization of gas infrastructure is another enabler for higher penetration of gas. I think we all have our work cut out in moving from 6 to 15%, but some of these things will surely help. So, sir, I'll take a pause. I'm not sure how long I should go on for, but I would give the others an opportunity, and we can always come back for a longer discussion.
Thank you so much, SP, for giving a bringing up very key points which are absolutely necessary and food for thought. And maybe just to summarize what you have said, that we are somewhere languishing between renewable energy and coal, and gas as a transition fuel has to find some space. Then infrastructure takes some time and it's capital intensive, so it needs to be, speeded up. Although you said that if the contracts are in place, infrastructure will also fall in place. But this is again a chicken and egg story, that infrastructure will come first or the market gets ready first. So that's debate which will keep on going for quite some time. But yes, there are different challenges to see that the affordability of gas is very critical, so that the environmental benefit of gas are accounted for in some way, one way or other. If we have to see like gas and power, 40% of global gas is consumed in power, but in India it is very low. Even in Japan, 60% of gas goes to power, but in India maybe it is around 20% or so. So a lot of work needs to be done in that part. Your key point, the secular distribution of infrastructure is a good word. Let's take it over from there. So now I will go to our second speaker, and I will request David to speak on transportation of hydrogen. In India, we have, Honorable Prime Minister has also announced hydrogen mission, and to take hydrogen in a mission mode. So a lot of challenges, definitely much more challenging than what gas sector is, because we already have some infrastructure and some sort of basic investment already done. But in hydrogen, things are going to be, pretty unpredictable, so to say. So I will stop here and I will look forward to hear from you, Mr. David.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thanks a lot to the organizers and thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure as usual to attend conference at this level, and therefore it's something for which I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. Now, hydrogen. In this very moment in history, pretty much everyone is talking about hydrogen. Every single company is looking at hydrogen. Majority of the companies, they have rough ideas about what hydrogen is and how can they basically integrate hydrogen within their scope. But everybody's feeling that there is a need for hydrogen to some extent. Now, what I like to call it is like there's a sort of hydrogen fever, which is actually very strong in India at least. And that's like not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's something that it goes in the right direction. And the expectation that has been set by the Honorable Prime Minister, as well as by many of the involved ministers over the past months, is certainly very, very, very important, because the target is ambitious to an extent that setting up clear minimum blending of green hydrogen in key industries such as refineries and fertilizers, it is indeed a very big target. And the timeline, the time horizon that they look like that is going to be announced shortly, it's not in a 10 years time, it's rather 2023 and 2024. So a blend of either like 5 or 10% green hydrogen for refineries and fertilizers to start with would basically automatically trigger a huge demand of green hydrogen in the local economy for local purposes, without even mentioning the possibility of exporting. Now, here comes the question, which is very important. There are some areas, geographic areas, where it does make more economic sense to generate green hydrogen, because green hydrogen, approximately 70% of the cost is basically based on the renewables, on the cost of renewables that you need in order to generate green hydrogen, and then the rest is electrolyzers and industrialization setup of a green hydrogen plant. Now, given this huge importance of renewables, first of all, India is playing a key role on a worldwide stage because of very low cost of renewable energy that is actually able to be produced in this country. Very affordable, very reliable, and very sustainable. But at the same time, there are areas where it does make more sense to generate green hydrogen, and other areas which are the final delivery points, which not necessarily it is in the same place. to get a better economics in the renewable side, you have to have stronger solar exposure, stronger sustainable wind, and therefore, let's assume, for instance, that it might be better to generate green hydrogen in the south of India, and then some of the refineries that we are seeing, or the major fertilizers, might be in the central or in the northern regions. So here comes the challenge. Where do you generate green hydrogen? Do you rather generate it right next to the delivery point and possibly pay a bigger price of it because of lack of physical space to set up a hydrogen power plant, or because of the fact that the area itself is more industrialized? If we think about Gujarat, Maharashtra, obviously it costs more than in other areas. Do you still generate it right next to the delivery point and deliver it right there? Or are you better off generating green hydrogen somewhere else in the country and then find a way to transport that? Now, Snam, being one of the largest gas infrastructure player, midstream player in the world, with 42,000 kilometers of high pressure pipelines, we are the second largest operator in the world for high pressure pipelines. That's where we actually started our assessment on green hydrogen, to basically use existing gas infrastructures to transport hydrogen wherever the market requires it. That is something that to us is essential, not only in order to minimize this delta price that I was describing before between generating it where it makes economic sense and delivering it to the final off-takers. If you can transport it into pipeline, you're able to minimize that delta and make sure you can deliver the cheapest available green hydrogen in a certain geography. But at the second level, let's say, there is an even broader view on this, which is giving a second life to gas infrastructure, the forever infrastructure, as we like to say. If something is going to deliver a hydrocarbon fossil fuel, by definition, in X number of years, and that would depend on the geography, it is different for sure between Europe and North America, India, and some other countries. But let's say in 50, 60, 70 years, there will be no more the need to transport that hydrocarbon fossil fuel. So if the infrastructure that you have created is able to accommodate green gases or completely renewable gases, those gases will always be transported no matter what. And therefore, building an infrastructure which is green hydrogen ready is building a forever infrastructure. Upgrading a pipeline to hydrogen is granting a second life to any pipeline in the world. So that's something that for Snam, it is extremely important. And our role in India is very much active on these fields and many other fields that we can discuss about, such as exporting hydrogen to other geographies, which might not be happening in pipelines, obviously, but rather on ammonia and regasification. But that's more or less the key essence of our presence in this country, and something that we certainly believe that the environment is very favorable in India, and we are sure hydrogen will be able to play a major role in this. And I will be happy to go through some of these initiatives in gas pipelines in the next few minutes.
Thank you so much, David, for touching upon various issues which are critical, and more so critical for India per se. Because if we are launching on the hydrogen mission and things are going to, if that needs to be realized, a lot of steps needs to be taken by various stakeholders. There's one thing to actually envisage or plan such type of work, but the second is to actually create that on the ground. And few things which you mentioned is that how much blending can be done with the existing natural gas pipeline. That is one key area where we are also trying to find some way that what are the regulation across the globe, and how maybe SNAM or other companies who are doing research on it will help us. Second is that whether the existing pipelines can be upgraded to handle hydrogen in a blended manner or exclusively the hydrogen. That is another point which we will be, like to hear maybe subsequently from you, David, about how ready we are with the existing infrastructure to handle hydrogen, either in a blended manner or exclusively the hydrogen pipeline. And as you rightly mentioned, we have going to go to 450 gigawatt of renewable energy. I don't think it will be consumed as such, because if all the sun is shining, I mean, you get maybe close to 300 to 350 gigawatt of energy that cannot be consumed. So it needs to be curtailed. And at that point of time, it is almost free. And that electricity can be used to generate hydrogen. So hydrogen can act as a good storage point besides battery, to see that it is available, and it can be used to hard to abate industry. So that's a very good opening remarks from you, David. Now I come to Dr. Klaus. I think you need no introduction, and we will definitely like to hear more from you that how the existing infrastructure can be made ready for using hydrogen. And with your, with your rich experience, you can throw some light on some critical equipments like compressors and turbines and other things where hydrogen can be used as a fuel either in a blended manner or exclusively in various customer segments. And what could be the metallurgy of the existing networks, maybe which are of higher grade steel, how it can handle hydrogen without embrittlement. So wherever you are comfortable with, we like to definitely hear from you. Over to you, Dr. Klaus.
Yeah, thank you very much about this. Just to clarify, would you like me to give my presentation at this point, or is this just some opening remarks?
It's up to you. We are okay with either of them.
I'd rather give my presentation. It's interesting because I think I have maybe a little different perspective than David, in that I may be looking at it more from a North American perspective, but I think that would make the discussion a little more interesting. If it's okay, I will share my presentation at this point in time.
Please go ahead.
See if that works. That's always a challenge. Can you see my presentation at this point in time?
Yeah, sure, we can see that.
Okay. I will talk a little bit about infrastructure options, and along similar lines as what David was talking about is how do you transport hydrogen, and where does hydrogen come from, etc. And how does that impact your infrastructure? And I'll start a little bit with economics for a couple of minutes. Everybody knows, I don't have to repeat this, what green hydrogen is, blue hydrogen. And basically, you really have just two sources of hydrogen here, if you're realistic about it. One is your green hydrogen, wind, solar, hydro, and then you have your blue or gray or whatever hydrogen from fossil sources. And the question is also not where it comes from, but also how do you transport it, and where is it locally available to the industry that may use it, because that's just as important. Basically, when you compare blue versus green hydrogen, you have the assumption that you're going to get your electricity for making green hydrogen for free, and that's based on the assumption of curtailment, meaning that you're not going to run a power plant otherwise. If you run the power plant, you're going to produce electricity. Remember always that running a power plant, be it an alternative energy power plant, costs you money, right? If you run a wind turbine or if you run a solar plant, regardless of if you're getting money or not money for the electricity, it's going to cost you to run it. So it is cheaper actually to shut down a power plant. Right? Green hydrogen can really be seen as a transport media for energy, just like electricity. Or it can be seen as a storage media for electricity. But it is a little bit problematic from a storage media perspective, because it really doesn't have a very good round trip efficiency. If you take electricity and you convert that into hydrogen, you lose 15% of that electricity in the process. And then when you try to convert that back into electricity at some other time and place, then you're going to lose another 30, 40, 50%, depending on the cycle that you use of your electricity. Your best round trip efficiency for hydrogen as a storage media is less than 40%, which really doesn't make it competitive as an energy storage media compared to compressed air energy storage, thermal energy storage, or even batteries. So green hydrogen as an energy storage medium is somewhat of a myth. And it really is more of a media for transportation of energy. Blue hydrogen, on the other hand, comes from natural gas and allows you to utilize the existing natural gas infrastructure. It's based on methane steam reforming or partial gas oxidation gasification. To remember, there is for every kilogram of hydrogen that you produce, about 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide is created. And so when you're talking about blue hydrogen, you're really talking about three value streams. You're talking about natural gas, you're talking about hydrogen, and you're actually talking about CO2 that you have to deal with. But in a sense, CO2 is a lot easier to deal with from a transportation perspective than hydrogen. Let's talk about green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen. Even if your electricity is free, completely free, your blue hydrogen is about 3 times cheaper than green hydrogen. It doesn't matter if your electricity is free. The infrastructure cost for green hydrogen is the electrolyzer is so much higher than what the fuel price would be. So it really doesn't make any sense to look at green hydrogen as a competitive market force against, if you're looking just from a hydrogen perspective, you cannot ever get, at least with anything in the next 10, 15 years for electrolyzer prices, you cannot see green hydrogen being competitive versus blue hydrogen. And this is including the sequestration separation costs. So if we really foresee a hydrogen future, where hydrogen becomes a significant part of the market for energy, then it's going to be blue hydrogen. It's not going to be green hydrogen. The only way this could ever change if electrolyzers come down significantly in price. And if you look at any trends right now, I mean, an electrolyzer is basically a battery, but it has a lot of the constituents of a battery. So it's not cheap, and it's not going to become that cheap. So at least from what we see in the world, we don't see green hydrogen play a significant role for a long time. We see blue hydrogen play a significant role, especially in North America, where natural gas is relatively inexpensive. So then the next question is, okay, what do you do with your hydrogen, right? You can either make your hydrogen at your natural gas source or at your green energy source, and transport it via pipeline by blending it into a natural gas pipeline in the United States. And in many other places, you have an existing pipeline network. Or you can develop its own infrastructure, a pipeline network that is dedicated to hydrogen. The problem with blending natural hydrogen into natural gas, and this is probably more so a problem in North America and in Europe, is that the pipeline network is very, very interconnected, meaning that if you put hydrogen in somewhere, it's going to come out somewhere else. And it's very unpredictable where it's going to come out. You're not going to say, I'm going to put hydrogen here, point A, and it's going to come out point B, but it's not going to come out everywhere else because all these pipes are interconnected. That really means that you're not going to be able to prevent hydrogen from going beyond the city gate, meaning into the domestic distribution system. Whereas it's relatively easy to control, let's say, build a power plant where you say, oh, I'm going to allow my natural gas combined cycle plant to take 20% hydrogen or 10% hydrogen, 15, or an industrial complex to convert that. It is nearly impossible to convert a city distribution system to allow any amount of hydrogen. My furnace, my heater, my stovetop, everything runs with natural gas. If you put in hydrogen into that system, even at small amounts, I have not the slightest idea what that's going to do, right? And nobody does. And so the entire idea of blending hydrogen into a natural gas distribution system is somewhat mythological. It's not going to happen in large amounts because the dangers associated with that are very, very, very significant, and it becomes unpredictable. There's also issues about stratifications and storage, et cetera, and I don't want to get too deeply into this. So really then the only other option is to come up with if you really want to transport hydrogen in large quantities, is to have a designated or dedicated hydrogen distribution system that transports 100% hydrogen. And that becomes very, very expensive. And I'll talk briefly about the complexities of hydrogen compression. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but that becomes very challenging because number one, of the high costs associated with hydrogen, but also because hydrogen is really not a very good gas for transportation. Hydrogen is highly flammable, it's dangerous, it's a very light gas. The compression of it becomes difficult. I'll talk about that very briefly. So it really isn't a very logical gas. And if you really think about it, why even bother? I mean, we have a natural gas distribution system, right? And most of our hydrogen is going to come from natural gas. So why even bother? So our likely scenario is that the blue hydrogen will dominate. We will continue to use our natural gas distribution system. Hydrogen will be created, will be made using steam reforming or gasification near the end user site, not anywhere where you then need long pipeline systems for hydrogen, but really where you're going to continue to transport the natural gas to the site where you want the hydrogen, you make the hydrogen, and now you have to deal with CO2, right? Because now you have to transport CO2, but CO2 transportation is a lot easier than hydrogen transportation. And so that's how what we see. We don't see any reason why you would start blending hydrogen into natural gas. It really certainly doesn't make any sense to spend all this money to build hydrogen pipelines. Just transport your natural gas to where you want your hydrogen, make hydrogen right there, and then where do you put your CO2? Well, at least in North America, and again, I'm sorry, most of my presentation is somewhat North America focused here, but in North America, there's plenty of geological formations, salt dome, abandoned mines, depleted oil wells, where you can put the CO2. I mean, the last estimates I've seen is that the current CO2 production levels there is about 250 years of CO2 storage just in salt domes in the United States. And the nice thing with these geological formations is that they're nicely distributed all over the United States. So you can make your hydrogen where you need it. You can then put your CO2 into a pipeline and you can transport it 100 miles, 200 miles to where you want to sequester it into the ground. Most of that sequestration would happen at about 2,000, 2,500 PSI. So we're not talking really, really high pressures. So what we see is actually not a lot of hydrogen pipelines, but we see 50,000 to 100,000 miles of new CO2 pipelines. We also think there's going to be additional natural gas transportation requirements because there's going to be natural gas utilized to make hydrogen for transportation fuels. And then finally, we see a lot of that CO2 being sequestered. I don't want to spend too much time. I want to just kind of briefly touch on the complexities of hydrogen compression and why it's actually not an easy thing to compress hydrogen. I'm not going to get into too much technical detail. But for a pure hydrogen compression, a typical pipeline would operate somewhere around 1,400 PSI. A typical application would either be an electrolyzer or a steam reformer to pipeline pressure, and then you would go into pipeline pressure. So we're talking pressure ratios of 2 to 3 or so. Natural gas versus hydrogen, these are very, very different animals. Hydrogen is a very light gas. It has an extremely wide flammability range. It has a negative Joule-Thomson coefficient, which means it heats up when it expands. So that's also a risk factor. It has a sound speed that's about 4 times higher than natural gas. So it's not like you can just replace natural gas with hydrogen. The design challenges of hydrogen compression are really that it's a very light gas. It's the lightest gas that there is. I'll talk about that briefly. It's very difficult to seal it, either in a compressor or in a pipeline, because it is a very small molecule. It just seeps out everywhere. It does cause hydrogen embrittlement, and coating against hydrogen embrittlement is very challenging. From a safety perspective, it has a very high explosivity, an incredibly wide flammability range, etc. Its leak detection is difficult. So hydrogen is, as much as we love to talk about hydrogen and the hydrogen economy and all that kind of stuff, and everybody loves it, reality check is hydrogen is really, really a difficult gas to deal with. And so it's easy to talk about how we're all going to do this, but it's difficult to actually implement it. I won't get into the equation, but basically, when you compress, I'll skip a couple of pages, but when you compress hydrogen versus, let's say, natural gas, you're looking at something where you need, for the same pressure ratio, you need something like 7 to 10 times more stages. I'm sorry, 3 to 4 times more stages in a compressor than you would need for natural gas. And you need a lot more power. I'll skip all these slides, but this is basically a chart that shows if you blend hydrogen into natural gas, which I already said was difficult, what would happen to your power? If you have 20%, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but let's say if you have 20% hydrogen down there, your power goes up by a little bit, and your gas still behaves somewhat like a natural gas, not from a safety perspective, not from a flammability, etc. perspective, but from a compressive perspective. If you put 50 or 60% hydrogen into your natural gas, suddenly your power went up by a factor of 2 or so. If you run 100% hydrogen versus natural gas, your power has just gone up by a factor of 10. And the number of stages that you need in a compressor, this is just for a compression ratio that's a typical pipeline compression ratio of 1.5 or so. You'll need about 30 to 40 compression stages, or you need to run your compressor really, really fast. This is just a comparison here. For a typical pipeline compressor, electrolyzer to pipeline, you would need 40 impeller stages in a compressor. That's a huge compressor. Compare that to a pipeline compressor, which has 3 to 4 stages. So the only other alternative there is to run it at a higher speed, to run your compressor at a higher speed. Sorry, I'll skip back. And that then brings significant challenges for materials, bearings, and drivers. I'll skip through some of this. There's a lot of technical detail. If anybody's interested in all this technical detail, I'd be happy to send that presentation to anybody later. But basically, it comes down to if you want to compress hydrogen, you'll need to either have a compressor with many, many stages, compression stages, 40 or 50 for a pressure ratio of 2.5, or you have to have a compressor that runs really, really fast beyond what current material limits are. So you have to get into advanced materials like continuously wound carbon fibers or advanced ceramics to run these compressors, which in itself is a challenge and doesn't exist. You can look at coatings for hydrogen embrittlement, and that's really not a long-term solution, because although coatings are nice to keep your hydrogen from going to the base metal, in reality they'll get desponded over time. And so you have to basically design something that has the strengths or maintains the strength of the material over a long period of time. And if a coating gets desponded over time, then you don't have that guarantee. I'll skip some of this. We have at Elliott, we've developed, obviously, we've been building hydrogen compressors for refineries for 60 years or so. And so we're somewhat familiar with all the challenges. You can make a hydrogen compressor, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. And especially if you're looking at a completely new infrastructure, it's probably not the most practical thing in the world. There are some other impacts. You don't just have to worry about the compressor. You have to worry about the entire pipeline network. I mentioned the increased leakage and flammability of hydrogen. You have to worry about the Joule-Thomson coefficient. Hydrogen does have a negative Joule-Thomson coefficient. So when it does expand, it actually heats up, which makes it more hazardous from a flammability perspective. Hydrogen has, as we all know, hydrogen embrittlement is a significant problem with materials. And then the final thing is, when you look at a pipeline network, hydrogen is somewhere about 10 times lighter than natural gas. So when you mix hydrogen and natural gas and let it sit for a long time, like you would, for example, in a large storage cavern, then the hydrogen may stratify and actually rise to the top, like you would expect for a light gas. And then you don't have a mixture anymore. And suddenly you're going to get these slugs of hydrogen going through your pipeline where you get 100% hydrogen. I'll skip all of this. I don't want to get too much into detail. Basically, it comes down to that we think that there's a lot of talk about green hydrogen, and there's a lot of talk about blue hydrogen. We think the future is in blue hydrogen. There will be a hydrogen economy because there needs to be a decarbonization of our energy and electricity market. But green hydrogen at this point in time is not competitive. And if you look at blue hydrogen, we're really not looking at a new hydrogen transport infrastructure. What we're really looking at is a carbon dioxide transport infrastructure that's needed. So I'll stop sharing my screen at this point in time. And I know I went a little longer than everybody else, but I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for bringing a very new perspective to what the people have been discussing across various platforms. And maybe this needs a close look at how we are going to transition into the energy systems and which is the more preferred option versus the other, or will it be left to the market dynamics to let it play out, and maybe the most advantageous both in terms of commercial and technological challenges, and also the infrastructure creation which will be required if we have to transition to a new fuel. So there will be different questions and different challenges which lies ahead. And what Dr. Klaus brought out is a very new perspective that hydrogen, although it seems to be a very clean fuel and green fuel, even if with the zero electricity cost, it's not actually making some commercial sense to use hydrogen. I mean, that's one point of view which can be further debated, because what you are suggesting, Doctor, is that CO2 transmission and sequestration could be a better solution rather than putting up a hydrogen-based ecosystem. So that needs to be addressed over a period of time, and maybe some solution will come in that which is more suitable for which country and things like that, and how technology changes, because there can be different solutions to a same problem. And the most optimum solution with respect to technology, as well as commercial affordability, as well as the availability of resources in a country, which will decide perhaps the best option which is available at that point of time and commercially viable also, will be, I mean, taking shape. So thank you very much, Doctor, for giving a different perspective to the whole thing. So I will request the organizers, if there are certain questions from the audience or from the participants, you can put up in the chat box or let me know. Otherwise, I will start off the discussion with putting some question from my end to the panelists and see how, if there are certain questions, we will go ahead. Dr. Klaus, just one request. When you are speaking, there was some break in your voice. Maybe when you speak, just come close to the mic. That will be great.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. It's 3 in the morning here. Actually, it's 4:20 in the morning here. I'm still trying to wake up.
So nice of you to take time in this odd hours, but it was really a pleasure to listen to you. So I think I will go back to SP again. I mean, there were certain very fundamental questions which Doctor raised. And Doctor, can you just mute yourself? That will be good. Yeah. So SP, if you can address some of these things which he mentioned about, because Total and Adani are planning together to go big in maybe hydrogen side also. So if you can throw some views on that, and also if we are going to build up a lot of infrastructure on gas side, will it be properly utilized in case technological disruptions comes, and will it be, I mean, whether the FIDs will take place as envisaged to go up to maybe 90 MTP of regas terminal capacities? Just we can have some thoughts from your end on this.
No, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Shingle. I wouldn't really want to get too much into the hydrogen side of things. That is I think, a very evolving piece within our joint venture. But we do fully recognize many of the points that Klaus has brought out in regards to the co-location of gas and hydrogen infrastructure, the challenges of the electrolyzers, and the need for CO2 sequestration if we are really to claim our blue hydrogen credentials. We recognize that the technology and the ecosystem is still in its infancy. And I think there is still a lot more work that needs to be done at our end, to be perfectly honest, before we can meaningfully input and augment to the very interesting presentation made by Klaus. So I will let that be for now, though I'm happy to respond to any specific questions on that. But I do want to say a few things about your second question, which was related to the amount of infrastructure and whether that will be stranded. In my opinion, I think if you look at the utilization of a regas terminal in India, I think if I've done the maths right, on average, we are utilizing regas capacity to the tune of 70%. So now that is a relatively high utilization rate of regas capacity when you're comparing our capacity utilization to other big users of LNG, for instance, North Asia, Japan, Korea, where utilization levels are really down in the mid-20s, and even Europe is not that much higher. So it really begs the question, why? And I think, again, I will go back to my opening remarks that we are very, we like to sort of match up demand and supply numbers, and we say, okay, because our demand is so much, we must have just enough capacity for meeting that demand. But as the events of the last few months have shown, we have never seen the kind of volatility in LNG pricing as we saw in the last few months. And frankly, I was asking my team to run a few numbers, and we were, we came up with this very interesting, which I hope is interesting to the audience, that there were times when you could have easily locked in a $10 arbitrage on your buy-sell price if you simply had enough storage available. Now, $10 arbitrage on a cargo, I don't have to explain this to you, but in general, that's about over $30 million per cargo of arbitrage was available. But because our infrastructure is so limited, we are not able to actually make use of strategic storage in LNG. So with the industry commoditizing, with more and more spot trades happening, and I think that the kind of political disruption that we've experienced with Russia, etc., and then all the possibility of embargoes in the Middle East, this likelihood of arbitrage will remain. And as we become a bigger player in gas, in order to be astute commercially, my submission to this panel and this audience is that we should be seriously looking at making more investment and not less in LNG infrastructure, because the payback of a tank, for example, of LNG could literally be a few cargoes under certain circumstances. So we need to think very broadly. We are emerging. We are today the fourth largest importer of LNG. And that is a significant amount of LNG that we are importing. And if we are going to grow bigger, we have to look at strategic storage options. I think the other reason why we must look at more infrastructure capacity is simply because there is a lot more savings to be had. Essentially, we are not importing more LNG and adding to the import bill. We are actually substituting more expensive, more polluting liquid fuels. So if you're looking at this from a nation first perspective, more LNG means forex savings. More LNG means a cleaner environment. So, and I'm actually emboldened by some of the things I've heard David and Klaus say, that I indeed believe that that gas has a very big role to play for the foreseeable future. I know this may not be politically expedient to say, but despite the best will in the world, I have some graphs here which show that even as late as the end of the century, gas continues to play a rather significant role in the energy mix of nations. So gas isn't going anywhere. We may all like to believe that we are going to move into renewable energy in a matter of a few years, but that ain't happening to the best of whatever I can see logically here. And I think, therefore, gas should continue to disproportionately grow in terms of infrastructure, in terms of its share in the primary energy mix in the years ahead. I have no doubt about that.
Thank you, SP, for bringing up a different perspective now from what we have been hearing. But it's good to hear, and being in gas industry, it's very music to the ears that gas is likely to continue for maybe many decades. So that's great. And definitely what Dr. Klaus also mentioned, there are challenges in adopting hydrogen in way of technical challenges primarily. So thank you. Now come to David, that there are challenges with respect to where we produce hydrogen and where we consume it. So there will be definitely an issue related to transporting it. And the most optimum solution is that you have curtailment of electricity and you produce hydrogen at the place of consumption. But that may not be feasible at that everywhere, and it may not be feasible that because of the consumption center could be somewhere else, which you briefly tested in your opening remarks also. But having said that, how do you see, because especially coming to what Dr. Klaus mentioned, what is your views or your maybe comments on seeing that how hydrogen is going to play role, particularly in India, where the infrastructure is yet to be developed, where the per capita consumption of energy is very low. So we see that there is a requirement of energy in terms of either whatever means it can be. So if you can throw some light on these aspects of discussions. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely, with pleasure. Well, first of all, let me start off with by saying that for India, in order to reach a much stronger decarbonization of its economies in the years to come, natural gas, it's clearly the most important element that is going to play a major role in the years to come. And increasing from 6 to 15%, the role of natural gas in the energy mix is precisely what is needed at this phase, because that's something that is going to be facilitating the replacement of more polluting type of fuels, such as diesel and LPG, at a very fast rate. So that is out of discussion that in a country like India, an increasing role of natural gas in the energy mix is more than welcome. And because of this, obviously, the 9th and 10th rounds of licenses, which has been awarding more than 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 city gas distribution licenses, that is going to play a very important role. And the new ones coming in the 11th round, they're going to make sure, as you correctly said at the beginning, to deliver gas at every foot doorstep in the country, with more than 90% of the country is going to be covered. So that is essential. And obviously, in Snam being, let's say, the second largest gas infrastructure player in the world, that's something that we very much believe, and we want to play a role also in expanding the national gas grid in India, and therefore we do welcome very much the plans for GAIL in particular to double the grid and to bring it to more than 30,000 kilometers of high pressure pipelines. That is the backbone of the initiative that would basically trigger the possibility to reach 15% natural gas in the energy mix, which obviously, combined with the fact that that native gas is very limited, that basically leads to a natural conclusion that import LNG terminals will be the only way in order to basically reach this target that has been set by the government. And we are very, very keen to play a role in this. Having said so, there are obviously different timelines when it comes to natural gas and green hydrogen, and we need to look at both of them. Now, obviously, without challenging anything on the technical side, because that's not my field of expertise, and for that we have our hydrogen business unit and engineering business unit that is going to look into that. I wouldn't dare challenging any of the technical assumption that has been brought up by Dr. Brun. So no question on that. What I can say is the role the SNAM has been playing in this field since when we started taking, let's say, a leading role of as gas midstream player in hydrogen. And in particular, I mean, there are some initiatives in Europe, such as the EU Backbone Initiative, which is aiming at converting and is putting together a pool of 12 TSOs all over the Union from 11 countries, out of which Snam being the largest one, we are the leading one, that is basically aiming at converting 40,000 kilometers of high pressure pipeline European grid to hydrogen by 2040. Out of which 2/3 of these pipelines are existing infrastructure that will have to be upgraded to be able to transport green hydrogen. Another 10,000, another third will be new facilities that will be put in place. The budget that has been allocated for this is between 40 to 80 billion euros over the next 9 years. And the cost of transporting 1 kilogram of green hydrogen in these pipelines over a distance of approximately 1,000 kilometers is in the order of 0.1 to 0.2 euro cents per kilo. So that's more or less some of the figures that are public and that are basically publicly available from this Green EU Backbone Initiative. So basically, Snam has been testing blending of green hydrogen in our grid extensively at different percentages. And what we are also offering is a sort of like end-to-end type of study that is able to assess the H2 readiness of the infrastructure to accommodate up to a certain percentage of green hydrogen. And that basically goes throughout the entire part of the net or the transmission grid, which is actually touched by a molecule of hydrogen. So whether it is the pipeline itself, the coating, the valves, the stations, the compressing stations, turbines, the city gates, the switches, all the way down to the downstream side of the green hydrogen value chain, which is basically assessing what could be the maximum level of blending in the hard to abate sectors, which are going to be the major off-takers of green hydrogen in the year to come. So that's basically our approach. And just to mention on the competitiveness, nowadays, I agree, it is not nowhere, but there are plans to make it competitive within a very reasonable time frame. I mean, without going too far, in India, Mr. Ambani has announced a 1-1-1 strategy, which is again something that is also present in the US, $1, 1 kg, 1 decade. So all of these initiatives, they might or might not become effective, but the investments which are basically happening in order to make green hydrogen more competitive are absolutely huge all over the world. And therefore we do forecast a significantly decreasing cost in electrolyzers, as well as in the entire green hydrogen generation value chain, that will be making it competitive in the year to come. When is hard to say, but it will become competitive. How fast it will become competitive is also up to the government and what type of incentives they will be putting in place.
Thank you very much, David. Just a follow-up question to you again, that what can be done to make pipeline infra hydrogen ready?
What can be done? Okay, basically, so there is a type of, there is this type of survey, or let's say assessment, that needs to be put in place, which is a H2 readiness type of assessment of the pipeline. So basically you go and deep dive into every bit of your infrastructure that get touched by a molecule of hydrogen, and you understand for each part up to which percentage it is able to accommodate green hydrogen. Let's say your pipeline, by the type of steel that has been used, the coating, etc., it can accommodate up to 10% green hydrogen. Your valves, which are in between two pipelines, or your switches, or whatever other element that is basically affected by the flow of hydrogen in that particular area that you're looking at, if it is only able to accommodate a blending of, let's say, maximum 5% of hydrogen, we can suggest a replacement of that single part of your infrastructure to something newer, which is able to accommodate a higher percentage. so that basically you are replacing whatever is lowering your maximum blending capacity in your infrastructure. Likewise, when you go to your compressing station or any other part of your infrastructure that is able to accommodate a lower percentage of hydrogen compared to the rest of your pipeline, we can come up with a dedicated solution to basically replace that portion only and increase the general percentage of blending throughout your entire infrastructure. It's a service that we offer and that we perform widely, and that basically can increase the readiness of your infrastructure to bigger blends of hydrogen. Obviously, not every infrastructure is able to do that, so we need to understand some of the basics and see in which part of your grid this is possible. We're talking about transmission high pressure pipelines.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. So coming to Dr. Klaus, there's a question from a participant that green hydrogen is considered from electrolysis. But what is your opinion about economics of green hydrogen from bio-based feedstock? Will that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it depends. I mean, you can make green hydrogen basically from gasification, right? So you can take your biomass waste, you can make synthesis gas out of that. Then you go through a water shift reaction, get rid of the carbon dioxide, sequester that, and you have hydrogen. And that's feasible. I mean, that's gasification, right? That's partial oxidation gasification. And that's been done for many years. Anything that's biomass related is always a question of, how far do you have to transport your biomass to the site where you gasify it, right? And so this is information that's forever old, but there were studies done in the 1990s in the US where basically it was determined that if you go more than 40 or 50 kilometers, so say 30 miles away from your biomass plant to transport your biomass to it, then it's not viable anymore. I mean, if you have sewer sludge or if you things like that, you're obviously better off making biogas, natural gas from a fermentation process. But if you're looking at wood chips, if you're looking at bagasse, if you're looking at pure biomass, and the gasification process works as long as you have enough of it available locally. So that's a process to make hydrogen, and that's competitive, and that's been done at reasonable rates. I would like to go back real briefly, and not to get into controversial arguments with David, but I do want to point out that I agree with him. These pipeline assessments have been made, and you can easily determine in a pipeline, wherever hydrogen touches, this is the valve can handle it, or the pipe can handle it, or whatever compressor station element can handle hydrogen or not, up to a certain percentage that does exist. The problem with that hydrogen blending arrangement is really that in most countries, the hydrogen doesn't stop at a power plant or at an industrial complex, but it goes beyond the city gate. It goes into the domestic distribution. And as I said before, where it is very easy to say, okay, my pipeline can handle 5% or 10% hydrogen, and you can make the same argument for your power plant. You can convert your power plant to handle that. It is impossible to do the same thing for a domestic distribution system, because everybody builds their own little things and everybody messes around with it. And I mean, I wouldn't know what would happen in my house with hydrogen coming in, because half of the pipes in my house I've laid myself. I'm not sure they can handle hydrogen. So I think that the fundamental issue with hydrogen blending is you have to come up with a method to stop it at the city gate. Otherwise, it's not viable. Sorry, I kind of wanted to step back on that, but I think that's a very important point that's often overlooked. Because I used to be a big proponent of hydrogen blending too, until I started looking at that in a lot of more detail over the last couple of years. So anyway, sorry about going back on a tangent on that.
So Klaus, is what you're saying then that you need to have a dedicated system of a pipeline where you have blended hydrogen, that you rather just, is that what where are you going with this then?
I mean, basically, there is very few applications where blended hydrogen is actually practical, there is a couple of applications where if you have a producer, a natural gas producer going just to an industrial complex where there is a single takeoff of the natural gas, then it's viable to do blending, right? Because then you know where it's going to go. Other than that, blending natural gas, hydrogen into natural gas in a normal pipeline where you have many offtakes going into other pipelines, going into branch lines, going into domestic distribution lines becomes impossible because you will end up with hydrogen in your domestic distribution, which is an uncontrollable risk. Yeah. And the other factor, especially if you have an interconnected pipeline system, is how do you control the percentage of hydrogen correctly? I mean, if you put in 20% in this line and then you have 20% coming from another point and 5% coming from another point, you're going to have varying hydrogen distribution. So the concept of I'm going to allow 5% hydrogen in my pipeline and my power plant is going to get 5%. That only works if you have a line that is a very simple pipeline. But for an interconnected pipeline system, that's not the case. And so at least from our perspective, we've almost discarded the entire concept. And I know there's people working on it, but we've almost discarded the entire concept of hydrogen blending into natural.
So would ammonia transportation find favor then in your mind compared to hydrogen?
Ammonia transportation is basically a neat method to transport hydrogen over a very long distance, right? And it's a very nice hydrogen carrier. And so that's what's favored by the Asians, by the Japanese currently, and the Koreans are looking into that. And so that's a method of transporting hydrogen. Please remember that methane is a very good hydrogen carrier too, right? 1 C and 4 H's, right?
Yeah, correct.
That's good. So any idea from anyone, any three of you, about the total carbon footprint of the total value chain? Hydrogen versus gas. So which in your view will be better placed in a more comprehensive and more macro level?
Myself, I think...
Anybody of you, maybe Dr. Pons, you can start on that.
Okay, yeah, so somebody else answer, please, because I've already said it.
No, go for it, Klaus. I think you're on a roll at the moment. Please go on.
I think natural gas is going to continue to be very, very dominant. I mean, there's plenty of natural gas, right? I think we're going to see continued conversion of coal power plants to natural gas in Europe and North America and other places too. LNG will continue to grow. I think whereas everybody's talking about hydrogen, everybody's building LNG facilities, right? I mean, the reality on the ground is that there's far more LNG being built than hydrogen's being built. Everybody's talking hydrogen, everybody's building LNG. So I see natural gas continue to be a very dominant player. I do see that if we are serious about decarbonization of the electric industry, aside from alternative energies continue to grow, I think we're going to see what you would call pre-combustion decarbonization. So basically making hydrogen near the power plants and making hydrogen near the industrial complex, which then leaves you with the CO2 disposal issue. And what we're seeing right now in many countries is that oil and gas companies are starting to look into the monetization of carbon dioxide, right? Oil and gas companies are very familiar with transporting stuff. Carbon dioxide, for example, is relatively easy to transport. Oil and gas companies are looking into, okay, how can we make money in the disposal business of carbon dioxide? And so what I see will happen in about 5-10 years or so is that oil and gas companies will actually charge money for every ton of CO2 that they sequester for an industry. So it's a monetization method for them. I mean, they're going to sell the natural gas on one side and they're going to dispose of the CO2 on the other side and make money on both sides. Why not?
Okay, thank you. Maybe David, you can have take a call on the total carbon footprint of LNG value chain versus hydrogen.
Well, I mean, clearly, it's a question that it depends on various factors, but and it also depends on different geographies. I would say that I don't think there's the same answer for all over the world. It depends on the stages where we're actually looking at this. It is, I mean, it's out of discussion that in theory, when you are implementing a full green hydrogen value chain, that is becoming something that becomes sustainable in the very long run. In the very long run, we're talking about tens of years and that type of unit of measure. While in the short term, obviously the decarbonization, particularly for a geography like India, would have to play a significant role on gas and LNG, because that's the only solution you have right now to basically play a role in the decarbonization of an economy such as India. So it depends on the geographies. When we look at, for instance, Europe and versus some other parts of the world, the fact that the governments of the various countries and the European Commission is trying to put in place a sort of fertile environment for purely decarbonized type of energies, such as green hydrogen, for instance, is clearly giving some sort of incentive in moving towards a certain direction. So what I was trying to say before, it also, the role of the governments in creating the right environment to facilitate and speed up the transition is essential. I mean, right now, what we understand from the Indian government is clearly that if what they have announced on the hydrogen mission will be converted into a regulation or a law, and likability that it is going to happen in very short time because of the COP26, etc., that is basically giving guidelines for industries to move directly to blending of pure green hydrogen in existing industrial fields. So that we can argue and dispute about competitiveness of green hydrogen versus blue and versus natural gas. We can argue about that and we can discuss about that. And there are, of course, some disincentives right now in the use of green hydrogen. But if that becomes a law, that is something that is going to generate and trigger the related demand in the country, which will further trigger the supply of whatever amount of green hydrogen will be needed as per the requirements imposed by the government. So that's why what I'm trying to say, it also depends very much on what is the environment that the government wants to create in order to facilitate and expedite the transition towards completely green type of fuels. So India is a clear example on this.
Thank you, David, for that. I will come to SP again for a quick response on one point. How do you feel that the ESG pressure of funding the infrastructure to fossil fuel, what do you think it will have any significant impact, or is it going to be, not that impact?
I think that's a really good question. There is pressure required to be put from many directions to actually incentivize the growth of environmentally friendlier fuels. And I think, whilst financing and the lobbies working in either direction will do what they need to do, I think surely creating the right fiscal incentives in the marketplace offer the best chance of hastening the transition towards gas and towards more environmentally friendly fuels. I think there's simply, as the recent example of Australia has shown, it is very, very hard to get nations all pointed in the same direction, because there are going to be big losers and big winners on either side of the debate. And therefore, I think, for me, I put that in the too difficult bucket, or category. For me, what is possible as a nation is for us to try and create the right incentives, to create the right frameworks. And listening to Klaus, for example, I've just started to think on carbon sequestration. Do we really have a plan for carbon sequestration? Because that's something, if you want to do green hydrogen, you need to have a very clear demonstrable plan of sequestration. Where is that plan today? What is the government's policy going to be towards incentivizing that infrastructure? Are we going to really have very strong carbon trading frameworks that are going to be developed in this country? Are we going to have rationalization on tax? Are we going to genuinely make all pipeline networks equitable and open access? To me, these are aspects, Mr. Shingle, which I feel are things that we can focus on. I personally don't think it is really a very feasible option for environmental groups to imagine that they're going to get punitive on projects that are going to produce more coal or more oil, because that's simply a too political and too complex topic.
Thank you.
In my simple mind.
Thank you very much, SP. I think it was my great pleasure and 1.5 hours well spent on discussing various aspects of infrastructure, logistics, hydrogen, gas, the impact and the planning and the transition of energy which India is going to make up. So we are running close to time, so I will quickly wrap up the whole thing. And it was wonderful. I mean, the panelists were absolutely, very honest and giving their opinions and views about it. And on a personal level, I also learned a lot about hearing from the experts on these areas. So going forward, India is definitely going to grow up in energy demands. The GDP is growing, so definitely energy demand is going to go up. So my view would be that let the market play a role wherein whatever infrastructure is required will definitely come in. So government can only give some directional things to make it more sustainable, to make it less impactful, less negative impact on the environment. But one takeaway for me is that gas is not going to go away primarily because, you can't just replace the infrastructure overnight. Every economy, every country has a different set of challenges, and we have to look into account what are the resources available, what is the government policy inclined to, what is the affordability, and what is the infrastructure currently available in the country, and what funding is going to come out to make it more sustainable. So India is in a place where it is rightly placed to see that the infrastructure is developed, which is more environmentally friendly, less carbon intensive, and at the same time it becomes more affordable and meet the energy demands of the countrymen. So it's a big challenge to, all the policymakers and stakeholders to make that really happen on ground. And just to sum it up, things can really look very rosy when you plan it, but when you start executing, things change a bit dramatically. So thank you very much for being here and giving your time for this panel discussion. And I will also like to thank the host for organizing this and Mr. Mathur for being a patient listener to all of your talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. It was a real pleasure on the behalf of organizers that you've done a wonderful job in, illustrating, the pitfalls of a hydrogen economy that we are all aiming for. All the best to everyone and all the best wishes to all the speakers, and let us move forward in the right direction as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Dipesh.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, and distinguished speakers. It was quite an insightful and informing session. So while we onboard the speakers for our upcoming session, we will take a short break and look forward to meet you again in next 5 minutes for a live session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We will be going live at 2:35 p.m. next 7 minutes. Thank you.